Good afternoon, everyone. It's great being here finally for this research network's its fourth event, if I'm not mistaken, and it's a great pleasure convening this network and its seminars with Francoise and Stefan and Johanna, and I'm sorry I wasn't here for the ones so far. So today we're going to have three talks, and I'm going to introduce speakers one by one as they speak on the topic of poison healing boundaries in East Asia, which I realize is a bit of a left field seminar for this series, which so far has been focusing more on the Amazon or in the Caribbean or the Americas. So this is an opportunity to engage with a different part of the world and a different time scale as well, as speakers are going to present on, well, I think Marta is going, well, 17th century, as you can see here. Now, the idea of this seminar arose in discussion within the group, and in particular, out of my interest, long-standing interest in different substances, plant-based and mineral-based substances in China, and how they have been used both as a healing or medicaments, but also as poisons. I'm not an expert on this in any way, but our speakers are. And so it's a great pleasure to first introduce Marta Hanson, who's been a friend and colleague of many projects over the past years, especially my previous project at CRASSH. Marta is an associate researcher at the Center of Advanced Studies in Erlangen in Germany, where she leads the German Studies Foundation project Knowing Hands, Chinese hand memory techniques and handy knowledge. And I'm sure you all know Marta's work on the history of Chinese medicine, especially her Speaking Epidemics book, which has been a landmark publication and has helped us completely reconceptualize the history of late Imperial Chinese medicines. So thank you very much, Marta, for coming all the way from Germany to talk about the social life of snake stones, 17th century.
Yeah, and I want to thank you, Christos, for inspiring me to pick up that old dusty draft that I had in my bin since almost 20 years now on snake stones. So I had a lot to catch up on in terms of the bibliography and what my colleagues have done on this subject because of this invitation to speak here. So my cover slide features a drawing of a large snake, possibly a boa constrictor or even an anaconda, by the Polish Jesuit Michael Bohm. He included it in one of the last entries at the end of Flora Sinensis, published in Vienna in 1656. The only one of his books, in fact, to be published during his lifetime. It was clearly a broader effort to win support from European leaders and the Pope for the exiled Southern Ming court in the first decade of the Qing rule. I'll return to this later. Bohm may well be most famous for having failed his mission as the Southern Ming's ambassador and dying in 1659 in southern China before even making it back to the exiled court. But to be fair, he is also well known for being the main person behind the two earliest Latin translations of Chinese medical texts, although both were published posthumously in the 1680s. Can I please continue?
I just want to pin you so that people online can see your face while you speak.
Okay, all right, and I'd like to go to the next one. Okay, go ahead. Then the first is the sixth, did you do it? Were you able to do it? Oh, yeah, there we are. Okay. The first is the 1682 specimen, Medicina Sinica, a sample of Chinese medicine, which clearly had several other people involved in both translating sections of it and securing its publication in Frankfurt, Germany. However, Bohm is not even listed as an author. Rather, we see the name of Andreas Clare, the German proto-medicus for the Dutch East India Company in Batavia, as the editor. There is quite a story behind that omission, and we'll come back to Clare later. 4 years later, Bohm's close colleague, Flemish Jesuit Philippe Couplé rectified problems that he saw in specimen and correctly attributed authorship to Bohm for the Clavis Medicus, a medical key, published in 1686 in Nuremberg, Germany. So in this talk, I will talk about first snake stones in the Kangxi court, and then snake stones in Roman Florence, back in Europe, and then what were snake stones, for goodness sakes? And then I'm going to come back to Bohm's Gentoo, or boa anaconda poison, that I had in my opening slide, with some questions about further research that I have yet to do on this topic. So I start my talk on the social life of snake stones with this four-part portrait from the 1738 English translation of Du Halde's Description de la Chine. It's in the chapter on the introduction and progress of Christianity in China. So moving clockwise from the upper right, there is German Jesuit Adam von Schall, a polymath scientist who was appointed to the new calendrical bureau of the Ming Court in 1630, who weathered the storms of the Qing transition in 1644, but suffered terribly from 1664 until his death in 1666 as a consequence of losing a competition in Chinese astronomy to the Chinese astronomer Yang Guangxian. Below him is Xu Guangxi, Matteo Ricci's first baptized Chinese Christian and the Jesuits' most important patron within the Ming court. To his left is Xu's granddaughter, Candida Hsu, who after being widowed at the age of 46, spent the rest of her life supporting the Catholic mission, and is considered to be, because of that, the most famous Catholic female Christian convert. Finally, we come to the Flemish Jesuit, Ferdinand Verbiest, a talented mathematician and astronomer in his own right. He was part of these 1660s conflicts with Van Schall, which he ended up surviving. And whereas only, elaborate, whereas the two portraits below, they only wear elaborate robes and also this headwear. The two portraits above are surrounded by scientific instruments, as they were the means by which they secured imperial favor within the Ming and then the subsequent Qing court. Their ultimate aim being to use their scientific knowledge to convert the emperor and so, of course, the Chinese Empire. The social life of snake stones was an integral part of this mid-17th century Jesuit missionary enterprise in China. In 1660, the Shunzhi Emperor asked Ferdinand Verbiest to assist and later replace German Jesuit Johann Adam Schall von Bell in the Calendrical Bureau. He managed to survive the several attacks on his position there, and under the Kangxi Emperor eventually became director of the Calendrical Bureau from 1674 to 1687. During this period, he also supervised the casting of cannon for the Qing suppression of the revolt of Three Feudatories Rebellion, the conquest of Taiwan in 1683, and fighting with the Russians in the north. So the year after the conclusion of the revolt of the Three Feudatories, Verbiest was made vice president of the Board of Works in 1682. He was famous thus for his knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, cannon making, and especially his ability to navigate the very possibly deadly Chinese court politics. Nonetheless, sometime between 1685 and his own unexpected death at the age of 64 in January 1688, after being thrown off of a horse, he wrote a short 5-page treatise on lapis serpentinus, or snake stones. Here's a Chinese version. It was formally printed on the origin and the use of the poison extracting stone, and several more pages of it to give you an idea. And there's one as well in Manchu. It's not clear which was first, the Chinese or the Manchu one, though scholars have hypothesized that Verbiest likely first wrote the Chinese and then translated into Manchu, especially for the Kangxi Emperor. Two scholars worked on the complete transliteration and translation of these texts in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But back in 1680s Beijing, the earliest indication of Kangxi's interest in Western medicine was in March 1685, when he sent two of his courtiers to Verbiest to ask him to arrange for European physicians to come to his court. And on the 1st of August, 1685, Verbiest wrote a letter about this emperor's wish to the Belgian Jesuit Charles de Noyelles, who was at the time the 12th Superior General of the Secretary of Jesus. In addition to explaining the importance of Western medicine for the Jesuit China mission, he requested that they send more medical books as well as Jesuit physicians to the Chinese mission. And considering all his work for the Qing military since 1674, it is not surprising that the first thing Verbius translated in response to Kangxi's initial interest in European medicine was a drug famous at the time for treating wounds and poisonous bites back in Europe. There are two identical copies of this treatise titled, there you go. Here, I give you the title, I won't read them, and also in Manchu, and they're all preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris. It is actually the first of 4 Manchu medical texts that the Jesuits wrote, along with the 2 Chinese versions, and represent, which is the reason why I'm so interested in it, the first example of Sino-European medical exchange or connected history in the Kangxi court. And this is a slide about things that happened subsequently. So Kangxi's interest in knowledge from Europe continued for the next 3 decades, as we see in this list of translations, when he had the new French Jesuit physicians, Bourbion, Perronin, and Bouvet, do write for him on Western medicinals, different medical matters, anatomy, and continuing actually in the 70s also on poisons and antidotes. So what were these snake stones? How did Verbius know about them? And why did he choose to introduce them to Kangxi? So that's the narrative arc of this whole story, which I will get to. Obviously, he wrote about them in response to Kangxi's new interest, but there's a much deeper history about what's going on what's connected to Bohm and what's going on in Europe. But both the Chinese term he used for snake stones and the Manchu transliteration did not exist before. They're not recorded in any previous Chinese materia medica or Manchu ones for that matter. Clearly, he created these neologisms in Chinese and Manchu for the translations he did, especially on snake stones. Li Shizhen, author of the most extensive materia medica of the time, used he mentioned several types of stones associated with snakes, Shuhuang, and also Shuhan Shi, yellow of the snake, stone contained within a snake. These are not the same thing, however. They are likely simply bezoar, a concretion found in the stomachs and intestines of some animals, mostly ruminants, sometimes humans. It was thought to be a poison antidote for a long time in antiquity, including in China. And a common kind of bezoar was the oxen bezoar used in Chinese medicine. So instead of a concretion from the stomach or intestines of snakes, Verbius wrote about a substance or conglomeration that came from the head of snakes and had its origin in India, not in China the way he wrote about it. But actually, the origin story comes out of China, which is what I'm going to get to. He made a distinction between the natural and artificial form of the substance. It has the capacity of absorbing all sorts of poisonous substances. This is the natural venom-attracting stone. The inhabitants break the stone to pieces and grind it together with the meat of the snake and some earth of the soil until it becomes a homogeneous whole. And then a stone-like form is given to it, which looks like a round pip. This is the artificial venom-attracting stone. Having the quality to extract poison, Verbius continued to write that the stone can cure the wounds and bites from snakes, scorpions, millipedes, and poisonous snakes. Furthermore, it can also be used as a treatment against sores. In some, he described that you could put it on a wound or a bite, the stone would adhere to the flesh, naturally absorb the poison, and once it was saturated, it would just fall off on its own. Human or cow milk would then be used to extract the poison from the stone so it could be reused, presumably indefinitely. And once the milk turned green, the milk would be discarded and the stone could be stored for later use. According to Liebrecht, who translated Verbius' Chinese essay on snake stones, the scientific analysis of so-called snake stones showed them to actually have been something like charred bone or bone ash, not snake concretions. And there to let everybody know at this point, there is no such thing as a stone that is in the head of snakes, no, even the large boas or anacondas. And so These kind of concretions are shown to be slightly absorptive, or but up to 20 to 25% of the weight, although that's, I think, a high estimation. And this kind of suction method, at least in the present day, has been proven not to be at all effective for pulling out venom, just on the scientific side of things. But that's not how things were going at that time. So my initial interest actually comes up from work I did on Manchu medical manuscripts. There's just some publications I made. And although the Manchu medical texts on Western medicine are only 4, considering the 58 titles that I found at the time, they're really very significant on doing connected medical history because they're about the Sino-European medical exchange, which I've been engaged in and very interested in, why I'm picking up this dusty paper. Here are the 4 main sources, and I point out that the Jesuits in 1710s and 20s returned to Kangxi's interest in their knowledge about poisons and anecdotes in a manuscript on explanations of issues asked. So so basically, I learned about the central importance of snake stones, both in Europe and in Asia at the time, through my research on these Manchu medical manuscripts. I first discussed it in a keynote address for a meeting on Chinese Western medical exchanges in 2007. I found them particularly interesting because they represented a medicinal that was once highly valued when it first arrived in Europe in the 1650s, and had a great big dispute about it, and was also clearly of interest to both Verbiest and the Kangxi Emperor. But it had since been largely forgotten and of just historical interest. I found this an interesting contrast with the rather successive Jesuit bark, or cinchona, to treat intermittent fevers, famously of Kangxi in 1692, which was written about in 1693, and what I considered at the time to be a failure of the Manchu anatomy to have any discernible influence on Chinese ways of thinking about the body. Part 2. So now we're going to move to snake stones in Rome and Florence. Thanks to the scholarship of historian of science Marta Baldwin, we also know a good deal about the dispute over the efficacy of snake stones as an antidote that occurred in Europe during the 1660s and 70s between the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, based at the Collegio Romano in Rome, obviously, and Medici physician Francesco Redi, based in Tuscany, Florence. Whereas Kircher argued that snake stones were effective antidotes based on both experimental and anecdotal evidence, but he thought that such claims were suspect and carried out experiments on dogs and chickens precisely to prove Kircher wrong. Her main argument is that they relied on different sources of authority at the time. Kircher accepted the authority of reports from his trusted colleagues abroad, and Redi favored artificially devised experiments with genteel European witnesses to test such reports. Baldwin notes that the earliest reference she has found to snake stones at all, period, before the Kircher-Redi dispute about them is, in fact, Polish Jesuit Michael Bohm, and about whom I began this talk. Bohm had returned to Italy by August 1652 as the representative of the Ming pretender Emperor Yongli, who had converted to Christianity in the hope of gaining Western support to help reestablish the Ming dynasty. And upon his return to Europe after 9 years in the South, Bohm totally failed to convince any sovereigns in Europe to support the former Ming dynasty. Of course, they preferred to stay out of such affairs. While residing in Rome for 3 years, however, he introduced to Europeans Chinese culture, and particularly China's fauna and flora. Bohm described the healing properties of snake stones in the book Flora Sinensis. Fructus Florsk, published in Vienna in 1656. Although considered the first book in Latin that focused on Chinese plants, there were earlier sources discussing Chinese flora and many other plants that originated from South. And also the other thing is that many of the plants he discussed are not native to China, but came from Southeast Asia and were transplanted there. There's evidence that quite a lot of information can be traced back to Li Shizhen, Spencao Gangmu, but it's not systematic. And there's a lot of information that is clearly not tied to Chinese materia medica, which is where I become very interested in the story, and trying to track that down. Later in 1658, while Boehm was stationed in India and corresponded directly with the Grand Duke of Tuscan, he mentioned in one of his letters that he had actually sent snake stones to the Duke from Portuguese Goa. So snake stones had become part of this gift economy of the Jesuits that participated in trying to gain patronage, right, back in Europe. The next European to write about snake stones was another member of the Society of Jesus, the German Jesuit Kircher, who I just introduced you to. He just a decade after Boehm's entry in Flora Sinensis, he devoted a chapter, quote, about the amazing qualities of the snake stones called La Piedra de la Cobra by the Portuguese in his China Illustrata of 1667. In addition to Boehm's Flora Sinensis, Kircher relied on interviews directly with Boehm while they both resided in Rome, as well as interviews and written reports of the Bavarian Jesuit Henry Roth, which I call above. This is an English translation of his text. In addition to these interviews and field reports, Kircher also conducted one experiment on snake stones in 1663 in front of witnesses, including, quote, a multitude of fathers and other curious men, unquote. He had a poisonous snake bite a dog and then placed a stone on the snake bite where it allegedly appeared on its own. And according to his testimony, his experiment confirmed the efficacy of snake stones. Finally, having drained off the poison, it fell away by itself like a leech saturated with blood. The dog was free from the poison, and although feverish for a while, was restored to the former health after about a day. Apparently inspired by Kircher's snake stone experiment on a dog, another Roman contemporary of Kircher, named Carlo Magnini, tested his own sample of snake stone when a viper by chance bit a laborer. Magnini recounted that his snake stone had the same effect on the bitten man as Kircher had described for the dog, except that the human subject also required drugs for his heart before fully recovering. Kircher reported this human experiment as additional evidence of the efficacy of snake stones as antidotes to poisons in his major treatise on magnetic philosophy. It was published 1667, same year as China Illustrata. And in this treatise, snake stones played a key role in his project to circulate more broadly the theory of occult magnetic forces, the Paracelsian doctrine of cure by similar substances or homeopathy, and his own interpretation of the natural action of poisons. He used these theories to explain how the concretion of a toxic viper magnetically attracted toxins circulating in the blood. And furthermore, Kircher espoused a Christian interpretation of poisons that posited a benevolent God as their creator to help purify the air and cleanse the earth for human habitation. Oh, well, sorry that you can't. It should be black. Sorry, Verbius' explanation of snake stones intended for the Kangxi Emperor. Oh, what happened there? I'll have to read it. Was exactly related to Kircher's magnetic philosophy. He says the reason why this venom-attracting stone has the capacity to attract venom is only because the material the stone has been made of and the nature of the poisonous snake are, in fact, identical. And after giving examples of other creatures with comparable qualities in his, venom-extracting stone treatise, he concluded that that Kircher's theory that poisons demonstrate the benevolence of God. This clearly shows that the Lord loves human beings. He has devised and harmonized creatures of every sort, each according to their own nature, so the whole world might be good and beautiful. So for the famous Jesuit astronomer, snake stones were no different than stars, as one more means to reveal the omnipotent and benevolent power of the Christian Lord. Clearly, Jesuits found snake stones not only useful as gifts to secure patronage, even if they fail, but also exemplary of a poison antidote relationship to support their vision of an underlying benevolent God. Oh, I see what happened. I did a little animation. I had too much time on my hand. Sorry about that, but it's a good reminder that a few other slides have the same thing going on. Okay. Verbius for his, now you can read them. Verbius for his part selected only the contemporary knowledge of snake stones, and his fellow Jesuits praised for him that served his proselytizing purposes, just as the Jesuits had previously withheld the Copernican concept of a sun-centered planetary system and misrepresented Copernicus to their Chinese colleagues from 1616 until 1760. Verbius did not mention the controversy that ensued shortly after Kircher's two 1667 publications that included essays that praised the efficacy of snake stones and then Reddy, of course, responded to. So after publishing a book on venomous serpents in 1664 that brought him some renown, Redi was appointed in 1666 to be one of the court physicians for the Medici in Florence, as well as superintendent of the ducal pharmacy. In the ducal pharmacy, Redi had easy access to the animals and poisons he needed for his further experiments. He emphasized the repeatability of experimental trials and changed the toxins and the animals with which he experimented on, whereas Kierkegaard, he argued, personally carried out just one experiment with snake stones and a viper-bitten dog, and included an account of the one experiment by Magnini carried out on a viper-bitten human. But Kierkegaard and Redi conducted their experiments in public before an audience of local elites, Kierkegaard in Rome, likely at the Jesuit Museum, at the Collegio Romano, where he was curator, and Redi in Florence, possibly at the University of Pisa, where he had graduated in 1647, and where philosophers and physicians who witnessed his experiments were members, and from where, etc., and could acknowledge what he had done. Redi had first conducted his experiments in 1662, threading tobacco oil through the flesh of 3 roosters. Tobacco oil laid in thread, and then placing this snake stone directly on the wounds. And the first experiment was not conclusive, so he tried 2 more. The roosters died. The third did not respond to the poison, et cetera, et cetera. This is all detailed in Martha Baldwin's article. So he continued to conduct experiments. He was really obsessed about this for a good 9 years, and published in 1671 his rebuttal to Kierkegaard in the form of a letter. He used the case of snake stones as a general challenge to the reputed efficacy of exotic and imported medicinals like, ginseng and other things. So now I remember. So just to wrap up Baldwin, where I've gotten this information, it's a really brilliant article. Again, Verbius said nothing about this controversy, etc. Even though, of course, Kierkegaard is one of the most well-known and prolific members of the Society of Jesus at the time. So what did Baldwin argue? She provides several compelling reasons why Redi publicly challenged Kierkegaard on snake stones as a poison antidote. First, he could more readily augment his stature as a physician in the Tuscan court by participating in scientific disputes with people outside of Florence, right? Remember, Kierkegaard's in Rome. Second, Redi opposed the Jesuits and derided their adherence to an outdated Aristotelian natural philosophy, as did many of his Florentine contemporaries. Choosing to deride Kierkegaard publicly, one of the most erudite scholars of the time, she argues, was probably pretty funny for his audiences. And then his public experiments helped secure patronage, of course, for himself in the Tuscan court. Furthermore, yes, there are commercial reasons, because the ducal pharmacy had a monopoly on theriac, and snake stones was a possible, antidote that could compete with the ducal's theriac source of income. So that was a big problem. And finally, and perhaps most significantly, Redi may have focused his ire, because you could say he was very adamantly against Kierkegaard and Bohm, et cetera, on snake stones. Generally, and Kierkegaard's advocacy of snake stones specifically, because he resented the competition that the Jesuits brought into the medical field that previously was dominated by physicians like himself. And Redi believed that since Jesuits were not medically trained, their medical advice should not be trusted. So that's part of her argument. Now, the Jesuits really were, in fact, encroaching on the drug market, and snake stones were a real threat because they had a monopoly themselves on cinchona, which was started out as being called Peruvian bark, and then later Jesuits bark. They actually supported many of their missions by selling this effective treatment for intermittent fevers. Clearly, snake stones were further encroaching on the ducal's commercial turf, as well as Redi's professional arena. Kierkegaard had also sent his own 2 books and Bohm's Flora Sinensis to the Medici court, and gifted a chest of medicines to another one of the patrons, the Duke of Aosta. He intended these gifts not only to promote the Society of Jesus, which also relied financially and politically on the benefaction of Catholic nobles, but also because the popes in the Holy City, where he resided, were not interested in patronizing his own work on natural history and medicine. Much good scholarship on the social life of snake stones that happened thereafter on the Chinese side has been done. And anybody who's interested in that, I can send articles, etc. I will not cover that. I'm going to turn now to what were snake stones and circle back to exactly what did Boehm write about them, and remaining questions about where the heck did he learn what he wrote about? Because it did not all come from Li Shizhen and Cao Gangmu. And I have some hypotheses. So I'd be very interested to hear people's opinions about. So, what were these things? Early 20th century scholarship here, it did write about snake stones. And I'm just going to pull out one of them, because we're talking about very different matters, and that's Halliday on snake stones. So what are they? They're things that resemble snakes, such as ammonites, for examples. That snakes possess a jewel or a stone has been a long idea, and that their head or body contained as stones with magical properties is also present in the literature. That other stones, really like fossil sea urchins, pieces of coral, or even glass beads, were considered to be a kind of snake stones or adder stones. And another class of snake stone, not derived from the serpentine shape, but for its extracting poison function or adhesive properties, he links to the Malays. That snake stones are made of some kind of metal, etc. So there's a long historiography of that. But recently, Rachel Pym has written a dissertation, several articles, and she's very, she comes from a pharmaceutical side. And just to give you a look at this is what the stone of the hairy cobra looked like. She gives a photograph of what it would look like, which I think is interesting. And she also talks about how different material things like charred horn or bone made into a black stone were also types of so-called snake stones, because they were made of astringent earth that could absorb such things at the time. And she even has evidence of 17th century manufacturing DIY in your home way of making snake stone from all sorts of things. And I'm not going to read this for you, but I just think it's wonderful evidence of the different things that snake stones could be referring to at the time. And I really, if anybody's interested, it's a wonderful summary of the historiography, including Baldwin's stuff as well, and this more scientific side on what the heck these things were. So there are many different things. And I think that's fascinating, precisely because it's not precise. And they range from fossils to charred bones to manufactured substances. And because it's considered a kind of a lexopharmic drug, it is especially relevant for studying, I think, these blurred categories between toxicity, venom, let's say, of snakes, and plant and animal animacy, which is the topic of the seminar. Okay, now back to Boehm's Gento. All right, so in 1656, Verbius, nearly everything he wrote on snake stones for Kamshi, in fact, came from Boehm's original account, and Kierkegaard's summary of that account and his other experiments and discussions. So where could have Boehm gotten all this information? And he talks about this as a suction. It's a kind of suction method. So one clue is to look at other types of writings on ways that you suck out poisons in the period. But as Pym says in her work, actually these treatments, the success is probably mostly because either the bite was not from a poisonous snake or the person was able to recover on their own. So Boehm's Flora sinensis was not the earliest. We have these other sources on it. You can see the kind of drugs that were, those of you who study plant history, they are coming in quite early, and they come in other types of sources. But his is focused, the first to focus on flora sinensis, Chinese plants, but what's so fascinating about that is that most of them did not originate in China. They come out of Southeast China and were transplanted into China. And Boehm traveled a lot in Southeast in that area, and he's some of the evidence is from Dengzhaoganmu, this materia medica from China, but it's not systematic, and it certainly does not account for all of the knowledge. He's picking it up from people, from his own experience, his own observations. Sitting in Rome, it seems to be drawing from memory, but some of these texts come from sources. We don't know what he actually brought with him in Rome. So again, to me, that's really fascinating as a historian. I would like to know more. So just a summary, he's got 22 plants, 8 animals. You can see the gento or the boa poison is near the end under the animal section. You can see for the period, beautifully illustrated. He's a very good drawer. I mean, you know, drawing by knowing is a big part of the period at the Jesuits. These are different plants, and I also just give a quick summary of the connections with the materia medica literature at the time, which previous scholars have already done. But what really interests me are things like sago palm and mangosteen, where it's clear that that information did not come from any Chinese source, at least that hasn't been found yet, and probably came from Chinese merchants he was in contact with, or yes, and maybe even Jesuit reports that are unpublished, etc. We have animals, 8 animals. These are just, as you see, very beautiful illustrations of them, and also very good work done on them already. So what little contribution can I do on this field that is actually quite well studied already? And this is the page that he wrote about the snake stones and focus on snake. This is what the actual passage looks like in the 1656 publication of Flora Sinensis in Latin. Fortunately, it has all been translated and I can work through it. There's 3 sections of it. The first section of it is okay. I don't think I have all the pages here from my notes, but I'll go. There's 3 sections. The first section is on the largest snake. The second one is the hairy cobra snake stone, or the snake stones. And the third one is on 2 other types of antidotes. First, a cobra plant, which I don't know exactly what that is, but I would like to track it down. And then the second one is on basically serpent wine theriac that you can still find in Chinese markets today. Right, so here I actually, in this case, is a translation. So they have a story of it devouring the, coming out of Hainan and Guangdong and Guangxi, where he traveled, and actually he had set up a mission in Hainan. And then this poisonous boa or anaconda can devour a whole deer by swallowing it and later mincing it into pieces, which I think accounts for why he has the musk deer in the same page as the snake. Then he says, it's not poisonous, etc. It's variegated grayish color, a length of 18 to 24 feet. It can leap hungrily from the bushes, stay erect on its tail, and struggle fiercely with beasts and man. And often it treacherously jumps down from a tree upon wayfarers and kills them in its coils. The Chinese believe its bile is a precious antidote against diseases of the eye. And there are, in fact, ample records of this in Materia Medica of this Dan. And I think it's useful to also look outside of the Materia Medica in local gazetteers, which I did. I'm sorry, I should explain, I'm going a bit fast. Logart is an extraordinary database that's in Max Planck of all these local gazetteers. And I did a search for this term on the bile of snakes and found many examples in Ming period local gazetteers in Hainan, Guangzhou, and Guangxi. So that's a source that people haven't connected with this that I think is good. How much time do I have? I'm wrapping up pretty well.
It's already past.
It is? I thought I had 45, 50 minutes.
50?
Yeah.
Oh, well, it's crystal season.
Okay, well, I'm almost done. I'll wrap up. So then the hairy cobra stone, this entire passage from Boehm about the cobras de cabello, or these hairy cobras, gets picked up by Kirka and responded to by Reddy, and then goes back to Verbius. This is it. But, so here's the drawing. You can see Kirka has somebody about to smash the head in of one of these cobras, maybe looking for its stone. And he writes also about the way that what it looks like, and that it clings by itself, just the kind of stuff we've talked about where I've already presented, and it picks out the poison, and then you dip it in milk to pull out the poison, and it returns back to being useful again. Exactly the things that Verbiest wrote about, and Kirka, etc. And then it ends on cobra root and snake wine theriac, which nobody writes about, actually, which I find both very interesting. The first one, again, cobra root, what was that? Which I probably someone has done research on it, and I just admit this is something I've picked up again and want to follow through on. And the other one, though, on this snake wine theriac is very much in Chinese materia medica, continues to be made today. And you put the snake in the wine that pulls out all its properties, and you take the snake out and you give it, actually, sometimes you just leave the snake in. Have you been to other snake alleys in China? You see these things. So we see here Reddy published in 1685, actually 1671 first in Latin, then 1685 first in Italian and then in Latin later, featuring these snake stones, the images of them. So they're a real tangible thing at the time. And I'm going to end with some conclusion and questions and sources of this episode in history and what interests me for further research. One is, why is he calling it Gentoo? So that, to me, that gives a hint that he's picking it up from southern China, and a different way of pronouncing this than the Chinese. Where is the anecdote about the venom-absorbing cobras de cabello coming from, which I think still has not been fully unpacked, and yet it's used, of course, in Reddy, and also Lapidus serpentis, which is the stone from the snake. And I'm suggesting for the research actually to look at Southeast Asia more broadly for evidence of suction type drugs like that the way this snake stone functions. There's an early 13th century text that really shows the kind of extent of the Chinese merchants and the way they run the drug trade in all of that area. That's one source. And so anything related to snakes and suction properties of different concretions or substances is one avenue of research. Of course, digging deeper into these local gazetteers, which I've already started for these other kinds of sources. But I'm going to conclude on Batavia, Jakarta, because in my research, just recently, I've realized that the Dutch East India archives there are extraordinarily rich. None of these Chinese texts that get published in 1680s would have made it there without particular connection with Batavia, I'll get to. So there's good archives, digitalized now that I can make use of. I've started using them. Now I was in Jakarta this summer. Couplé, who's he's the person who actually gets Boehm's books published in the 80s posthumously. He's involved with the snake stone trade too, and he actually sent them, according to this letter, to Reddy. And Fire, who I started to talk out as the editor of the first text, the specimen, 1682, based in Batavia, is the key linchpin, I think, for the entire Boehm post-posthumous publications, because he's the one who actually has the money to buy these manuscripts. He's the one that's connected with German physicians through the Academie Naturae Curiosorum, and he is the one who actually pays for and sends these manuscripts for publication in Germany, first in Frankfurt and then in Nuremberg. So he climbs up really quickly in the Dutch East India Archive from very low level, largely because he has family there. He inherits a house from his aunt by marriage. So he probably also with that has a plantation, but that evidence isn't yet there. And he's involved with the drug trade there. They're trying to compete with the Chinese who are already established. And Batavia is a very well cosmopolitan city for the time. It is, and all the Jesuits go through there, and he He's actually at the center working in the apothecary at the Batavia Castle. The archives of the medicinal shop and the company's apothecary are extant. So that's a place to look for these snake stones and other kinds of things that interest me in the drug trade in the period. And the notarial archive is particularly rich. This is an actual land contract for a plantation that Clier bought in 1689 after he returned from Japan, where he bought, including 61 slaves and enslaved children, which places him in the upper financial echelons of the Batavian society. There's also slave contracts available, so one can act, and every slave had a contract, so you can get at that level in these archives. So finally, I probably have more questions than answers, satisfy you, but I think he's a linchpin in this global history specimen and Clavis. He's always been thought as a side person, but I think he's a linchpin. And I think to get at the full range of Boehm sources beyond Chinese Materia Medica, we have to look at other types of Chinese sources, but also I think looking at Southeast Asian drug trade and the sources available, there may be a useful avenue to take. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Yang Yu as our third speaker. Professor Yu is an associate professor at the Department of History at Buffalo, specializing in medical cultures of medieval China. His research has been groundbreaking in examining the entanglements of pharmacology, religious healing, and the history of the senses, with his book Healing with Poisons being an absolute masterpiece in making us think very differently about poisons and medicine and many more things, including mysterious creatures of that cause poison and are really at the forefront of what we may call both history and anthropological thinking about medicine, but also multi-species relations. So, Jan, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, Christos.
Great, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Christos, for the nice introduction. Thank you all for coming to the seminar. It's my great pleasure to present my work together with Marta and Elisabeth. Their fantastic talks focus on the early modern period and the contemporary, period around the world. And my talk will bring you back to earlier time of antiquity and the first millennium after the Common Era, and share my thoughts on the vitality of vital power of plants through the lens of poisons in therapy, in healing. This is primarily based on the book Chris just mentioned. I published 4 years ago, and in addition to that, I also show some preliminary work on the comparative study of Du and Pharmacon in Greek and Chinese pharmacy. So let me start with a vignette. So actually, this is a connection to my connection to Cambridge. That more than a decade ago, when I was still a PhD student, I had the opportunity. This is back in 2012, I think, to visit the Needham Research Institute at Cambridge to do my dissertation research, and I had a chance to browse the archives of Joseph Needham at the Institute, and I find an interesting letter, which was written in 1973 by historian of science Donald Berghahn, and he at the time lived in Kyoto, Japan, and he sent this letter to Needham in Cambridge. So the letter involves a series of questions Wagner raised to Needham. The last question is about a plant called Ravolfia, Luofumu in Chinese. This plant doesn't appear in pre-modern Chinese materia medica literature, but it is used, as Wagner says in the letter, it's used as a major tranquilizer and anti-hypertensive in modern biomedicine. However, according to one of his friends who was a Swedish physician, Ravolfia was not widely used in the West because of its double effect, or we also call it side effect these days, such as depressing the blood pressure and causing severe depression. So Wagner then continued to say that, quote, this is at the end of the letter, it seems that one of the great problems in the introduction of modern medicine in many parts of the world is that modern therapies often have unpleasant side effects like this, while traditional therapies, including therapies in China, generally do not. It might easily be that the compiler of a pharmacopoeia was careful back in history to exclude cures which he felt were worse than the disease, end quote. Upon reading this letter, Needham did some further research on Rauwolfia, the plant, and actually find that although the herb doesn't appear in pre-modern Chinese Mathematica, it was incorporated into local Mathematica literature in southern China, like in Yunnan area in southwest China, from the 20th century onward. And in the end, Needham agrees with Wagner that, quote, no doubt your argument about difficult side effects hold good in the past, end quote. And then he also points out that, quote, now that the alkaloid, so this is an active ingredient of the herb, can be separated, it is a different matter. So the implication here, based on this comments from Needham, is that if the active ingredient of the herb can be extracted by modern scientific methods, it could be used safely and effectively to treat a variety of diseases. So this epistolary exchange reveals this contrast between the so-called traditional therapies and the modern biomedical therapies that often put these two therapies in a sharp contrast, a dichotomy. Traditional therapies are more natural, the modern therapies are more artificial. Traditional therapies are milder and modern therapies are more violent. And then this is to the point of, based on this discussion between Wagner and Needham, right? No side effects, very little side effects from traditional therapies because doctors back then eliminate those medicines that can have very strong side effects because they consider that's worse than the disease itself. Well, modern therapies, especially biomedical therapies, with lots of side effects, which is problematic. And so the one way to bridge the two, as envisioned by Needham and his methodology, is basically to isolation of the active ingredient from these traditional medicines, and then that can be, then people can use these medicines more safely and effectively to treat a variety of diseases. So basically, I question this this simple and problematic dichotomy because my study of Mathematica in pre-modern China has shown that there's a long tradition of using powerful or potent substances, we call poisons in Chinese medicine. This sounds paradoxical, but this is precisely the point I'd like to share with you. So as a way, I'd like to invite you to rethink these modern concepts of side effects and active ingredients through my study of poisons in Chinese medicine. So that's basically my kind of intervention for today's talk. I want to give you some examples of some of the most frequently used poisons in Chinese medicine. This is based on 11th century Mathematica text called Zhenglei Bencao, verified and classified Mathematica. But actually the use of these variety of substances can be traced back to much earlier in China, back to the ancient time. And aconite is probably one of the most frequently used, most famous poisons in Chinese pharmacy, still being used these days in China and elsewhere in the world. It's basically, I'll talk more about this plant in a minute. Basically, the tuber of the plant will harvest it. The best aconite is considered to be coming from the southwest region, the modern Sichuan province, is especially the northern part of it. the whole plants is highly toxic, and the tubers were harvested in the past and processed to cure a variety of illnesses. And other examples, because Chinese material medica did not just include plants, actually, although I think the focus of my talk today will be on the vital power of plants, lying with the central theme of this seminar. Some other examples, such as mineral poisons, cinnabar is the mercury compound, realgar, arsenic compound, animal matters, the python gallbladder. This is actually what Marta mentioned in her talk. In Chinese, this is called 燃蛇胆. So Marta has shown you, in early modern period time, especially from local gazetteers, you have a lot of mentioning of this interest in animal products, because the pythons coming from that region in the far south. But this actually, the use of python's gallbladder in medicine can be traced back to much earlier times, as early as the 5th century after the Common Era. So, and then cinnamons as well. Interestingly, this is placed not in the plant category, but in the category of food in Chinese medicine. So consumed regularly, but with a small dose, it can nourish the body, can enhance life, but consumed in a large dose and rapidly, it can cause all kinds of problems, including mental problems, according to the writing of material medica in China. So a little bit more information about aconite, because this is, something I have done more extensive research. Aconite actually refer to a large group of plants belong to the Aconitum genus in modern, categorization. So this is 3 of the most frequently used aconite types in pre-modern China, called fuzi, wutou, and tianxiong. Actually, echoing Elisabeth's talk early on, naming matters here, right? Because they refer to different kind of, aconite sort of species that's in the modern biomedical or biological, parlance. But back then, of course, there was no such, category. They basically give different names to different type of aconites based on the season of harvesting these plants, also based on the the morphology, the appearance of the tubers, right? So fuzi, which is showing on, so the tubers highlighted here, fuzi on the left, literally means attached offspring. This is basically depicts the side tubers that grow in the summertime, while wutou at the center literally means black head, refer to the main tuber of the head of the herb, harvested in the springtime. And finally, tianxiong literally means heavenly champion, designates a particular kind of main tuber that never produces side tubers. So you can see the concentration of poison there is the highest. Hence, it's not so rare, not so frequently used tianxiong, because the potency is very, very, very strong. And fuzi actually is used much more frequently because it's a side tuber, and so the level of potency is less. Okay. Speaking of the existing literature on the study of poisons in Chinese medicine, I have to mention a very important early work by historian of science, medicine, and sinologist Frederick Obinje. He published this book in 1997 in French called L'Aconie and L'Orpiment, Aconite and Orpiment. I already introduced aconite, and orpiment is one of the arsenic compound used in Chinese medicine. And drugs and poison in Chinese Asian medieval China. So Obinje's work is very important and offers extensive study of poisons in Chinese medicine from antiquity to 11th century, with a particular focus on the medical understandings of poisons and the pharmaceutical principles underlying their usage. So it's the later foundational work for my research. And my book, published 4 years ago in 2021, built upon Obinje's earlier work, further explores the topic by tracing the history of the therapeutic use of poisons in China from the 3rd to the 8th century, situating the study in the medical, social, political, and religious culture, especially Taoist alchemical context at the time. In this talk, I will discuss the paradoxical meaning of du based on a part of chapter 1, a word that could mean both poison and medicine, among other things, its implication in Chinese pharmacy in early time, and finally compare du to pharmacon, as I mentioned before. So this is basically the outline, the 3 parts: etymology of du in early Chinese culture, the meaning of du in early Chinese pharmacy, and finally du and the pharmacon, a comparison, a preliminary comparison. Starting with the etymology of du, okay? So this is basically the Chinese character. This is a modern character. Well, it's similar to the modern character of du. The Chinese word for du, like its English counterpart, invites association in modern context with danger, harm, and intrigue, right? So if you talk to, a person in China saying du or du yao or du pin, du, it's always involves negative connotation. It's bad, it's dangerous, it's harmful. But in the past, similar in the poison in English context, that's a similar connotation. But in the past, the meaning of du was quite different and diverse. I want to give you some examples, some of the earliest meanings of du in Chinese history, starting from oracle bones. This is based on history of medicine and sinologist Constance Cook's recent work. She is a specialist on reading oracle bones, particular medical characters in it. And this is based on her interpretation. This is the du character in oracle bones. And the upper part refers to a foot, a human foot. And then the lower part refers to snake or turtle or creatures. So potentially dangerous creatures. So the combination of the two indicates a person stepping on a venomous animal like snake. Therefore, du in this context surely has a negative connotation, right? The threats posed by dangerous creatures in nature. But over the next millennium, actually these oracle bones can be traced back to the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. In the next millennium, we have more meanings of du emerged in ancient divinational texts, philosophical texts. I'm just giving you one example. This is the Dao De Jing, the foundational text in philosophical Taoism in China, dating from around 4th century before the Common Era. So it talks about these two foundational concepts, which is Dao and De, right? So basically, therefore, mirror things all revere Dao and honor De, which is virtue. That Dao is revered and virtue, honor is ordained by no one, is ever so of itself. That's basic explanation of the relationship between Dao and De. And following that passage, we see, therefore, the Dao creates all things, and virtue, De, raises them, cultivates them, and fosters them, and rears them and nurtures them. So nurtures them, here basically is my translation of du, nourishes them and protects them. So you can see that all these words highlighted in green are synonymous words, nurturing, cultivating, fostering, which indicates, this power of de, right? So when we think about the power of plant, but this is a power of creating all things in the world as envisioned by this early Taoist text that facilitates the growth of all things in the world, right? So du, actually not the du here, doesn't have a negative meaning. Actually, it's quite positive, right? It embodies the unfolding of the cosmos, basically. So moving to the Han period time, this is from the 2nd century before the Common Era and 2nd century after the Common Era. We have more dictionaries, so offering more this kind of glossing of the du in these dictionaries. In the first dictionary in China, called 说文解字, explaining characters, we find a more elaborate explanation of du. So the foundational meaning here actually is thickness. And thickness actually refers to the quality of lofty mountains. That's basically the explanation of the word thickness in this dictionary. The word implies heaviness, intensity, and abundance. it doesn't carry a obvious negative sense. So that's the foundational meaning. And then there's a secondary meaning of do that dictionary offered, which clearly points to a negative connotation of word. It referred to the harmful grass that grows everywhere. A sense of thickness is still implied here. The poisonous plant is rampant, wanton, and unconstrained. To support this idea, the dictionary partitions the character into two parts. This is, one particular way to break this is the character of do, right? The upper part, which refers to grass. That's basically the radical for grass. And then the lower part means unvirtuous person. Altogether, do denotes an herb that engenders harm. Do is explicitly tied to plants in this dictionary. You can see this is very interesting because we know that, well, beyond, at least in the context of Material Medica, plants constitute a major part, but there are other parts like minerals, food, and animal matters, as I showed you before. But particular link between do and plant here indicates the rapid expansion of herbal knowledge during this period of time in Han. So I think this is something interesting emerging during this period. So moving to the second part of my talk, I want to talk about do, the expression of do in early Chinese pharmacy. And so I see some consistency here, the duality of do, the paradoxical meaning of do, as seen in Han medical texts. Here I want to focus on the Material Medica texts. So this is the foundational text called Divine Farmers, Divine Farmers Classic Material Medica, 神农本草经, formed in the Eastern Han period around 1st century after the Common Era. So the genre of 本草 here, in Chinese, literally means roots and grass, or based on grass, again, 草, right? So, 本, roots, this all refer to the herbal knowledge. But although by no means the Material Medica text here includes just herbs and plants, includes other things as well. But herbs definitely play a very important role, a dominant role in this text, as in all the following Material Medica texts in China. So, so I translated Benzao as a Material Medica. This is a genre of pharmacological writing in China, starting from the Han period time. This is a foundational text for that. That provides a list of drugs, in this case, 365 drugs, each specifying the properties, the location, morphology, and most importantly, the medical values of the drug. The genre is not unique in China. There's a similar genre in Europe, which can be traced back to antiquity, the 1st century work, the Material Medica by Dioscorides, the Greek physician. So my translation of Benzao as Material Medica underscores the similarity between the two pharmacological genres. I'll talk more about the second text later in my talk. So in this text, in Divine Farmers Classic, it's a basic index to categorize drugs. So basically, in the preface of the book, it parses 365 drugs into 3 categories based on the level of do. So the top level contains 120 drugs. They are without do, most of them without do. I think pretty much all of them without do. Which are used to enhance life. And I want to hear to say a bit more about this upper level drugs, although not without do, but in the original text, it also elaborates that taking them in large amounts for a long period of time doesn't harm people. Those who wish to lighten the body and enhance qi should rely on the higher level drugs, the top level drugs. So the lightening the body here, I find this interesting connection to Elisabeth's talk early on. This is basically particularly associated with the drugs at the top that can nourish the body, lighten the body, and achieve the beneficial effect. So the middle level drugs, 120s, they are sometimes, some of them with do, some of them without do. They are used to prevent illness. And finally, the bottom level contains 125. Most of these drugs are with DO, and they are used to cure illness. So you can see from life enhancement to prevention of illness to the cure of illness, there is a hierarchy here, and drugs with various level of DO are used to achieve these various goals. This system of categorization based on DO remained very stable actually in Chinese pharmacy throughout the pre-modern period up to the Li Shizhen's text in 16th century, as both Marta and Elisabeth mentioned early on. DO figured not as something to be avoided at all costs, but as potency valuable in the cure of illness in particular. So as my etymological analysis has shown, DO could evoke both benefit and danger. This ambivalence is well preserved in this pharmacological text, which urges that one should only resort to a potent matter for short periods with caution and stop using it once the illness is cured. A DO-possessing drug, the text implies, cures if used judiciously and harms if it is not. So basically, the paradoxical meaning of DO was well preserved in the Han Mathematical text, which spoke of potency, right? So the ability not just to harm as a poison, but also to cure as a medicine. This is the foundation for the medical use of poisons in China. Instead of avoiding poisons entirely, doctors in China from early on, from the Han period on, if not earlier, developed a variety of methods and techniques to transform poisons into therapeutic agents. And these methods include dosage control, drug combination, combining poison with other non-poisonous drugs to alleviate its potency, and drug processing, heating, soaking, cutting, etc., etc. For example, aconite, most of the times, raw aconite was rarely used in Chinese pharmacy. It had to be processed, often through a series of techniques and rituals to eventually made it safe and effective to treat illnesses. So I can talk more about these various techniques in the Q&A, but now let's move on to the second text I want to share with you, collected commentary to the Divine Farmer's Classic Materia Medica. And so this is basically a text produced by a medical writer, alchemist and Taoist master named Tao Hongjing in late 5th century. And the text emerged from the southeastern region of China. And you can see that the commentary here, which is Chinese character Zhu, this is a long tradition, not restricted to medicine, but definitely seen in the Materia Medica genre. The core of this tradition is the Divine Farmer's Classic, right, as I mentioned before. And then later Materia Medica works, starting from the 5th century, Tao Hongjing's work, copied these texts, the earlier text, and added layers of commentaries at the end of each of the drug entry. As a result, they added more drugs, they explained more for each of the drug entry. So the text, as a result, expanded over time, from the 5th century to the 7th century to the 11th century, it's get expanded. And this tradition continued way to the early modern period, such as Li Shizhen's systematic Materia Medica. So the text I focus on here by Tao Hongjing, I have some quite pretty interesting manuscript to show you. This is a 7th century copy of the 5th century text. It's a fragment produced from Turfan in the far west region, but it's revealing because you can see the layers of the text shown by different colors of writing. The red color, this is basically an entry, a swallow dropping. The red color actually refer to the original text, Divine Farmer's Classic during the Han. So it contains information such as, the properties of the drug, its taste, degree of heat. It also shows a variety of illnesses the drug treat, as well as its location of harvesting the drug. And then the writing, the black part is a commentary including specifying the do status, right? This is you do, which is with do, right? So possessing do, and also the information about how to specify the animal in nature. So this information we can only find in the 5th century commentary, not in the original Divine Farmers Classic, the you do, would do, indicating this a more developed knowledge of specifying the do for each drugs in Chinese mathematica during this period of time. So briefly, this text contains 730 drugs, so double the number from the original, Divine Farmers Classic. Introduced new categories of natural properties, placing drugs into minerals, herbs, animals, and foods. Explain further the morphology, location, and medical values, and most relevant to my own work is specify the do status of this drug. Without do, with little do, with do, or with great do, right? So various degrees of do associated with some of these drugs, especially in the lower echelon of the hierarchy. So this is basically just a quick summary of all the do possessing drugs in this text. You can see herbs constitute a big part, which is not surprising. Altogether, about 1/5 the drugs are possessing do in this text, and herb have more than 50, and animal more than 35, minerals about 10, and foods are less than 10, 7. In terms of percentage, you can see that actually the animal drugs has the highest percentage of do possessing drugs, about 30%, and followed by herbs, 18%. And by contrast, the category of food contains the least number of drugs, only 8%, which is understandable since most of these substances can be consumed regularly to nourish the body. And we can also see the proportion of drugs if we take a look at various mathematical texts over time from the 1st century to the 16th century. That, as I mentioned before, the sheer quantity of number of drugs increased over time from 365 to about 1900 by the time of systematic mathematica. But it's interesting to see that the proportion of do possessing drugs or poisons remained more or less constant, about 20%. So the number increased from 80 to 300 during the late Ming period, 16th century. So this is indication of the continuous use of these powerful drugs in pre-modern Chinese mathematica. So finally, I want to move to the discussion of a comparison of do and pharmacon. Ancient time, but moving to late period as well. And of course, it's well known that there are foundational important books and scholars working on the comparative study of medicine in antiquity by Geoffrey Lloyd. In this audience, Nathan Sivan and Hisa Kuriyama. And my work here is preliminary and speculative, and particularly from the angle of comparing mathematica and thinking about the relationship between poison and medicine in Greek and Chinese medicine. So pharmacon is a concept that some of you might have known, and this is a word, the modern word pharmacology, pharmacy derives from. This is a Greek word, which could mean both harmful poison and medical cure, similar to do to a certain degree. The word actually has many other meanings, such as pigment, perfume, spell, magical drink, talisman, filter, and others. The ambivalence of the word pharmacon is manifested in ancient Greek philosophical writings. In a well-known article back in the 1960s by Jacques Derrida, he examined the paradoxical meaning of the word pharmacon in Plato's works, with particular attention to the relationship between writing and speech. Writing resembles pharmacon. It is a remedy in the sense that it seeks to preserve the truth of a speech that would be otherwise forgotten. Yet it also has its dark side because it's highly fluid and unstable, readily sabotaging speech and destroying its integrity. And that's actually the part Derrida try to emphasize, consistent with his deconstructionist, scholarship. My focus here, of course, is more on medical. It's less on the philosophical part. I want to examine expression of pharmacon in material medical work. And I will bring back to the figure I mentioned before, Dioscorides, living in the 1st century, the Greek physician, and the important work he produced called the Material Medica, which is a foundational work in European, Western pharmacology, exerted influence throughout the medieval period and well into the 17th century. So it contains about 800 drugs and plants, animal, minerals. That's the main category of drugs based on natural property, and also offers information about morphology, location, property, and of course, medical values of each drug. So we do find poisons in the medical. This is kind of an expression of pharmacon in the medical context. So there are about 80 drugs that Dioscorides considered poisonous. Most of them produce unpleasant but mild side effects, such as headaches, dim-sightedness, and discomfort of the stomach. But there is a cluster of drugs with stronger power. This is in book 4, including opium poppy, henbane, thorn apple, mandrake, and hemlock. The last was quite famous because presumably that was the poison that Socrates took to end his life. Hemlock appears as a pharmacon in Dioscorides' work. On the one hand, hemlock belongs to the plants that are deadly, hitting by chilling through and through. It's a lethal poison. But on the other hand, Dioscorides submits, having been dried, is highly useful for restoring health, and it does quell shingles and erysipelas, which is acute infection with skin rash, when plastered on. Basically, this is a topical use of the poison. One good example of that. Thus far, I have shown the similarity between Greek and Chinese pharmacy. Do and pharmacon are similar concepts. The idea, the therapeutic use of poisons. But I also want to demonstrate some interesting differences by comparing these two foundational pharmacological texts in 3 aspects. In the aspects of the drug properties, so both texts provide specified certain drug properties. In the Materia Medica, you have the warming and the cooling, you have the softening and astringent, you have luring, inducing, and drying, offered in pairs here, right? So Chinese pharmacy, degree of heat and hotness, cold, cooling, heating, plain, and then the flavor. This is including sweet, pungent, salty, bitter, and sour. And it's interesting to think about the synesthesia from this perspective. This involves at least flavor, taste, and also the sensation of the body. And here, and do status, as I mentioned before. So you can see that do actually play a very important role when you think about the drug properties in Chinese medicine and in the early Chinese pharmacopoeia, but not so much as a central criteria in the Materia Medica. By just comparing the number of poisons in these 2 texts, you can see that roughly, we have 20% of poisons in Divine Farmer's Classic, but about 10%, so double the number, the percentage. And that 20% actually remained quite stable in Chinese Materia Medica throughout the pre-modern era. And finally, I want to demonstrate this aspect of absolute poisons. By absolute poisons, I mean poisons without any medicinal values. It does pop up in Materia Medica text in Dioscorides' work, right? So not many, 6 I find in his book, including, yew, meadow, saffron, dogbane, wolfbane. And wolfbane actually referred to a aconite type of plant available in Europe. But if I look into Divine Farmer's Classic, actually, none. This is quite interesting. Every single drug in given farmer's classic had medicinal value, there's no absolute poisons. The reason that Decolonising include these absolute poisons, I suppose they are simply try to warn against their usage, actually, right? So, but not in Chinese pharmacy. And so in the book on the medical understanding of poisons in medieval and early modern Europe, historian of medicine Frederick Gibbs has argued that classical toxicology in Europe, influenced by the idea of pharmacon, didn't make a clear distinction between poison and medicine. It primarily dealt with cases poisoning, to discern symptoms induced by poisons, to develop remedies to counter poisons. It was not until the late medieval era, from the 13th century onward, that European medical writers started to conceptualize the nature of poison and regard it as an ontological distinct category from medicine. They use the term like specific form of poisons that can have a specific effect on the body, particularly the heart part of the body. Although the theoretical discussion about the unique characteristics of poison was lacking in antiquity, it was also important to note that works of empirical nature, such as Dioscorides' De Materia Medica, testify to a subtle distinction between poison and medicine already in antiquity. In early modern Europe, this separation became between medicine and poisons, between pharmacology and toxicology, became more pronounced, as shown by the recent book, The Poison Trials by Alicia Rankin. This is a book on the development of antidotes, which connects to Marta's talk as well. She shows in detail how efforts of identifying effective antidotes, such as Teriac, continue to be contributed to the development of toxicology and experimental science in early modern Europe. However, in pre-modern China, the separation between poisons and medicines was not as obvious. This doesn't mean that toxicological knowledge was unknown in pre-modern China. Quite the opposite. There was abundant discussion about poison detection and poison treatments. There's an antidote as well, discussion of antidotes in Chinese pharmacy. Yet, in pre-modern China, by and large, toxicology was always part of pharmacology, was not separation. No example illustrates this difference than the distinct fates of aconite in Greek and Chinese pharmacy. In Dioscorides' work, De Materia Medica, the herb called wolfsbane, this is a 6th century Byzantine copy of the text, there's no curative value of wolfsbane. In no less than 17 places in his work, he talked about treatment for aconite poisoning, bespeaking its great danger. But in China, aconite, called fuzi, was highly valued for its therapeutic power, to the degree that it was hailed by Tao Hongjing, the 5th century medical compiler, as the lure of the 100 drugs. And this is also based on earlier Albinger's work in the 8th century formula book, 外台秘药, the Tang book. Among the 6,000 formulas there, about 10% used aconite, quite a large proportion. When we think about Derrida's work, Plato's Pharmacy, in his assessment of Plato's philosophy, he directs our attention to the negative aspects of pharmacon. There is no such thing as a harmless remedy. The pharmacon can never be simply beneficial. Yet, if we compare this to a 2nd century before Common Era philosophical and political text, Masters of Huainan, which talk about aconite, but in a quite different light. For all things under heaven, nothing is more vicious than the poison of aconite. Yet, a good doctor packs and stores it because it's useful. So you can see that the idea of ambiguity in the paradox between poison and medicine definitely was there in both cultures, but there's a different emphasis in these two cultures. And now here I speculate this difference derived from different therapeutic logic between the two medical cultures. If Dioscorides considered toxicity as the cause of unpleasant side effects, Chinese physicians deemed it as the very source of curative power. In other words, Greek pharmacy prescribed poisons in spite of their toxicity. Chinese pharmacy prescribed poisons because of it. So I want to just, how much time do I have now?
I think you need to conclude, Jan.
Okay, so let me just bring an epilogue, and then I'll conclude. So there is a change of the meaning of "do" in early modern Chinese medical texts. And then I'll bring the systematic Mathematica to your attention. This text Marta and Elisabeth both mentioned in their talks. This is based on early research of the etymology of "do" by historian medicine Paul Ongshue. He found that actually some poisons do possessing herbs in this text, such as Gangua, Yuanhua, in the processing methods, the discussion of the processing method of a drug, it says that when using it, boil it with good vinegar for 12 times, remove vinegar and soak it in water overnight, dry it under the sun and use it. The poison, do, that's the same character, is then annihilated. So basically, what you can see here is that the do here doesn't have a positive meaning, doesn't refer to the therapeutic value. Actually, something negative, harmful, that need to be annihilated, destroyed, eliminated in order to safeguard the safe use of the toxic drug here. So you can see that the distinction between poison and medicine is visible here, and it's tempting to speculate what may have caused this distinction. The year before Li Shizhen's systematic Mathematica was published posthumously in Nanjing, the Italian Jesuit Matteo Rizzi was heading to the same city in his proselytical mission in China. I'm not suggesting that Li and Rizzi were connected. There was no evidence for that. But the activities of Jesuits in the 16th, 17th centuries, as shown in Marta's talk, who introduced European science, medicine, and antidotes, like snake stones, to the Chinese audience, might have contributed to the altered perception of poison in China. And alternatively, it's also entirely possible that the new way of thinking about poison was of indigenous origins, which came into being independently of European influence. So to conclude, so my talk highlights the fluid materiality of medicines that defied stable characterization in China. Every substance in Chinese pharmacy is not a fixed entity that can be unambiguously reduced to a material essence, but as fluid materiality that is subject to constant transformations. So basically, rather than think about those two concepts as distinct categories, I'd like to invite you to think about the intimate relationship blurring this boundary. And actually, whether something was poison or medicine is always content dependent, depends on the techniques of proper management, depends on the social and political values, and depending on the sensations induced on individual bodies. And each of these issues is addressed in each of the 3 units of my book, if you're interested in learning them more. And finally, I want to come back to the 2 concepts I tried to interrogate at the beginning. Active ingredients, and this is basically bringing up to the story of Tuyoyo that Elisabeth talked about, actually Marta also write about, the successful story of isolating artemisinin, the active ingredient from Artemisia qinghao, which won her Nobel Prize in 2015, one of the most effective remedies to treat malaria today. And so the active ingredient is an interesting concept derived from 19th century Europe, become golden standard for drug development in modern pharmacology. But it's important, although there's many reasons to celebrate the successful story of Tuyoyo, we need to also caution against this reductionist approach guided by modern science. Right? In early Chinese medical history, drugs were not understood to contain such a pure and invariant material core. It was a context of a drug, its interplay with other drugs, its preparation, its mode of acting upon a particular body that shape its therapeutic outcome. In this regard, the concept of drug assemblage proposed by philosophers Deleuze and Guattari is relevant. Right? When discussing the function of psychoactive drugs, they challenge the idea of reducing these substances to definitive molecules and contend that Through dynamic interaction with a fluid body, drugs can produce varied effects and alter a person in myriad ways. So similarly, it's better to consider any given medicine trained pharmacy not as an independent, self-sufficient entity, but rather as something working in assemblage, in which healing always works in a relational way. And finally, I want to invite you to rethink the idea of side effects as well. So by this point, I think it's sufficiently clear that this misconceived dichotomy between Chinese and modern biomedicine is very problematic, right? My goal, of course, is not just to say that certain drugs in Chinese medicine also induce side effects, and we need to be careful. Instead, I try to interrogate the very concept of side effects itself. Right? In modern biomedicine, side effects are perceived as the inevitable adverse outcome of a pharmacological product. The assumption is that any drug therapy induces both the intended primary effects, which is positive, and the unintended side effects, which is negative. So great effort has been made to minimize the latter so as to reduce the toxicity of medicines. Tellingly, such a concept of side effect was not so visible in pre-modern Chinese medicine, and it's not so visible in many parts of the world traditional remedy. So here I want to just borrow the wisdom from the medical anthropologist Nida Atkin. In her studies of traditional healing in Nigeria, she finds that the outcome of therapy is often interpreted as dynamic and systematic. In such systems, healing takes place in multiple stages, each of which is manifested by distinct body signs and sensations, and each of which in turn requires careful management by the physician or patient. So healing, in essence, is a processual thing. And in this regard, to minimize the so-called side effects of poison in healing is a moot point, precisely because these effects are the manifestation of very therapeutic power of the poison. Thank you very much for your attention and time.